Roxbury is one of my favorite places of all times. You might ask, where is Roxbury? Well, Roxbury is an abandoned settlement on the South Mountain in Annapolis County, about 4 or 5 miles south of the little village of Paradise. Now, I first became interested in Roxbury when probably in the early 60s. I used to bike back there. It was only one way in, one way out. And I was sort of intrigued by the stone walls, the graveyards. So when I began teaching school in Halifax, I used to visit the old provincial archives with Dr. Bruce Ferguson, and quickly found out that there was very, very little information on that little settlement. When we'd come home summers or vacations, I would try and find as much information as possible. Very little, but I did manage to talk to a few people, searched old church records, school records, and little by little I found out more and more, which made me more interested, and then other people got interested, and I started accumulating this all together. When we moved home here in 1972, I continued and would visit Roxbury frequently and take people with me to research. And I started to accumulate some information, enough that I was asked to give talks to certain historic groups, school groups, whatever. And lo and behold, in 1988, I got a call from the executive producer of the CBC's suppertime show called First Edition with Paul Barr, and it was called The Great Outdoors. Lo and behold, they wanted to do a documentary. Well, I was sort of amazed and thrilled, and a little bit nervous at the time, but we did that, and it went over very well, and more people got interested, and of course over the years, up till a couple years ago, many radio stations, newspapers, other TV programs, they even made a movie back there. So this prompted me to gather this information together, and my wife Paulette said, well, you better get this done before people start dying off that would be interested in this. So we accumulated this and wrote a book, Lore and History of Roxbury, Lost in the Woods. And that was in 2005. And after the book was launched, interest peaked. I was taking groups back now and then. I had taken school groups, historic trips. It became very popular. And in 2012, we formed a group called Friends of Roxbury and received money from the provincial government and also Lafarge Canada to put up signage. And as a result of putting up signage, I didn't have to take trips anymore. When people call and say, well, can you take us to Roxbury? I say, I would love to, but now I don't have to because you can follow the signage. And it gives you all the details that you'd like to know. And of course, when you write a book and you accumulate a lot of information, and when it's out there to the general public, people will come forth and say, I just remembered something, or I have something here that you might be interested in. So that caused me and gave me impetus to write another book. And that was called Roxbury Return to a Ghost Town, and I put that out in 2015. I'd like to read part of chapter 9 out of the newest book, The Roxbury Return to a Ghost Town. This chapter title is called A Love Story, Ken and Maggie. Now, as I read this, there will be some history involved here, and this sort of gives a background to the community and a story of one family. Now, as we're going through these trying times with this COVID-19 crazy stuff, the little settlement of Roxbury went through its trying times as well. Got to remember, these people were in the middle of the woods. There was no doctor. They worked in the woods. They were in a dangerous situation, sawmills, way in the woods. And if there was ever an accident or a problem, the nearest doctor was in Bridgetown, which would be hours away. And also, The typhoid fever was a major factor in some of the early deaths of the especially the younger people of the settlement, and also childbirth. Childbirth was a risk. There was no doctor. There might have been a midwife, but it was the community, the settlement, and the families that came together in times of crisis. I'm just going to read maybe 4 or 5 pages of this to give you a little insight, and it's called a love story, Ken and Maggie. Margaret was born in 1880. Her half-brother, John Kendall, would have been 4 at the time. Margaret became affectionately known as Maggie. Kenneth Hines was 2 years older than Maggie and lived just down the Roxbury Road. His father was Joseph Roland Hines, son of Michael Hines, an original Roxbury grantee. His mother, Permelia, was a Burns. Kenneth was the 8th child out of 10 born to the Hines. Families took care of families, and when there was a medical crisis in the settlement, everybody helped out. Being isolated did not deter risking their lives in the woods, running a sawmill, creating log booms on Paradise Lake, or taking part in the spring log run on the Paradise Brook. Women continued to have babies. Most families were large, averaging a child every 2 years. The families of Roxbury lived life to the fullest. They enjoyed the happy times, and they dealt with each other in every crisis when it happened. All 10 of Roll and Permelia's kids attended school in Roxbury. The school stayed open until about 1890. Ken would have been 10 at the time of its closing and probably received no more formal education. Frank, his older brother by 12 years, was already helping out on the family farm, and little Ken always looked up to his big brother and father. Maggie Gormley and Ken Hines were schoolmates. They played together, and they went to Sunday school in their school classroom once a month when the Methodist minister came from Bridgetown. When the minister didn't make it, someone from the settlement conducted the lessons and provided leadership. A lot of the times it was Maggie's mother, Ann, who took charge of the Sunday school classes. Sometimes Ken and Maggie made their trip together with Ken's father, Roll, when he ventured to Paradise for supplies. It was 1887. Ken was 8 and Maggie was 7. It was a big deal to travel the 6 miles off the South Mountain to see the sights of Paradise, with its general store and big church. Once they hit the valley floor, they passed the tannery shop, many houses, and the hustle and bustle of the people moving about, either walking with or their horses in small riding wagons. The roads seemed much wider and smoother than they were used to in Roxbury. They dare not stay too long at the Brooks' general store because a 2-hour trip back home would put them at the Mile Rock just about darkness crept towards them over the South Mountain. However, Roll's team of horses were used to the road and knew their way back to the settlement. The supplies usually consisted of barrels of flour and molasses. If there was any mail postmarked Roxbury, that came as well. The molasses came by rail from New Brunswick, and Ken Brooks kept a supply on hand for his customers. Various other sundries were packed around the bigger items, but there was always room for 2 or 3 kids from the settlement to make the trip to the valley. The Gormley homestead was considered the post office in Roxbury. Occasionally, Maggie would deliver letters to the other families in the settlement. She found this to be quite entertaining. She got to see the neighbors and see her schoolmates at the same time. Her delivery could take her to almost Paradise Lake if there was a letter for John Derlin or John Lake. But she didn't mind. There were lots of pastures and orchards to gaze at, and there was always a team of horses or oxen making their way from the Jackson Mill on Paradise Lake. She never seemed to be alone. When she got older, Ken would go with her. He too enjoyed the same scenery and Maggie's company. They grew older together, it seemed. By the turn of the century, Maggie had approached 20 years of age. Her maternal grandmother was still living with the Gormleys. Brothers Uritt and Willie had left home, and younger brother Joshua moved to the United States in 1902. Just down the road, the Hines farm was in full operation. Many of Roll and Permelia's offspring had left home for a life off the South Mountain. Like many other families, they went looking for work in the Boston States, and usually found it. Most never returned. Frank and Ken stayed, however, helping their father, who was aging. Roll was advancing in years, but maintained a keen interest in his land. By the mid-1890s, the lumbering involvement in Roxbury was starting to decline. The Jackson Mill on the eastern shore of Paradise Lake was going strong, but the supply of logs was starting to dwindle. Crews were having to go further and further from the mill to get prime spruce timber. Some of the Jackson Mill workers who lived in Roxbury were relying more on their farm for income. There was a market for apples, and the orchards of the settlement were abundant with their fruit. More and more, their trips to the valley were with barrels of apples as opposed to milled lumber. Ken Hines and his brother Frank had worked for a period of time for Chris Jackson, but by the turn of the century, they were concentrating their efforts towards their father's farm. Roll Hines' health was in decline and was scaling back his farm work. By 1900, a few families had moved from Roxbury and had left behind productive orchards that needed care and upkeep. Ken and Frank took over their expanded role and kept the vacant farms in productivity. The forest fire of 1903 put an end to the lumber industry in Roxbury. The Jackson Mill moved to woodlands on the Roxbury Brook, which was parallel to the Roxbury Road. The mill site was about 1 mile from the current-day Highway 201. Some men from the settlement worked there, but now a lot of the workers commuted from nearby Paradise and Lawrencetown. Maggie and Ken were now adults, and by the year 1905 they decided to get married. After all, Ken was 27 and Maggie was 25. By the standards in those days, the couple were on the end of the marriage spectrum. Maggie's mother, Ann, was married at 17. They were possibly married in Ann's home. Joshua Gormley had returned from the States and was there for the wedding. In fact, he stood with Ken and Minnie Jackson was Maggie's bridesmaid. Minnie was the daughter of Chris Jackson, who operated the mill in Paradise Lake. The minister performing the ceremony was Reverend M.W. Brown. The Roxbury wedding took place Christmas Eve, 1905. Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Hines moved in with his parents. Life continued on the farm, and within a year, Maggie was pregnant. The couple were fortunate to have Ken's mother, Pamelia, there to guide them through any difficulty during those precious last months, delivery and postnatal care. It was a perfect setup. After all, Mrs. Hines had brought 10 of her own children into the world. In 1906, her youngest, Johnson Hines, would turn 25. In Roxbury, there was nothing to ease the agony of childbirth. There were no epidurals, no spinals, and no LeMay's training to help prepare the mother-to-be. Women went through the grueling hours of pain to bring a child into the world, and many babies died in infancy because of widespread disease. 1906 turned into 1907, January and February being particularly cold months with more than average snow. Tragedy struck the Hines household on February 19th. The birthing was obviously difficult, more than Pamelia could handle. The entire situation was more than the family could handle and more than the settlement could muster. In the end, mother and child were lost. It was a heart-wrenching event. Ken had lost the love of his life and their child. He was a broken man. Maggie and her baby were laid to rest in the Gormley Cemetery plot in the field behind the homestead. It was a sad occasion. Roxbury had lost another child and a mother.